Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Rishab joins me, and we're going to discuss infrastructure as code, Terraform, and some other kind of critical aspects of building your application that are important to consider, especially when getting into kind of more professional applications and stuff like that. But before we get to that, Rishab, could you maybe get into a little bit of your background and kind of your story as it comes to your tech career so far?
So I started my tech career as a help desk or a tech support person, supporting clients with a SaaS product that a company had that I was working for at the time. And soon I realized they were using AWS as the cloud platform in the back end and got interested into, how all these services are hosted. Was really fascinated that you could rent, servers and compute power from another company and use it to host your application. So I just started exploring it. I spent about a year in tech support, got promoted to cloud engineer. There was an opening, so moved internally within the company and spent about 2 years as a cloud engineer until I was moved into DevOps. So, and now I work as a developer evangelist here at Twilio, and it's been more than a year. So that's the big picture, how my career has been. Yeah.
Sounds like a cool kind of career path that you've had so far. And that kind of leads us right into, you mentioned that you've kind of been working in more of kind of the DevOps space now. And that also kind of brings with it working with infrastructure as code and Terraform and stuff like that. So I think a good place to start here is, I know when I first heard of the concept of infrastructure as code, it made zero sense to me. I was like, what do you mean? This feels very abstract to me. So maybe we could start with what is infrastructure as code, and then we'll kind of get into like how it's practical and different things like that.
For sure. Yeah. So if you break down the term itself, it basically is that where you're defining your infrastructure as code file. It can be a file, it can be multiple files. So infrastructure could be servers, your VMs within the cloud. I know it's called EC2 in AWS, VMs in Azure, and then VMs in GCP or any other cloud provider that you use. I think it's Droplets in DigitalOcean. But it could be anything. So any resource that you can think of that you might go into the UI in the console and deploy it within a cloud provider, you can do that as code instead of going through the UI. So the upside to that is you could basically automate and script all these deployments that you have been doing manually. So I think that's the big, goal with infrastructure as code.
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and I very well might not be, because my main focus has been on like React, JavaScript, front-end development, stuff like that. And I would say the further I get into my career, the more I see some of these benefits of understanding infrastructure as code and different things like this. But my understanding is kind of like you mentioned, you have like your application infrastructure. So this could be like your front-end part of your application, your back-end, and then everything that kind of is connected to that, your entire infrastructure that allows your application to work. And this infrastructure as code idea is effectively, you could have some code in a certain file that can effectively deploy your infrastructure in like different environments and stuff like that. Does it sound like I'm kind of understanding this conceptually?
Yes. Correct. That is correct. Yeah, I think I should have mentioned that all this infrastructure is needed for your application to run. So whether it's, React app, where you need resources to run your front end and back end or a database. So all of these resources exist in a cloud provider. So your understanding is correct. In order to deploy those resources to make your app functional and live on the internet, you can deploy infrastructure using code.
Gotcha. Perfect. And kind of with that, my understanding is that there's also some different kind of tools that help you do this. And I believe, I'm super not familiar with it, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Terraform is one of these tools that can potentially help you implement infrastructure as code. Is that correct?
Yes. It is one of the tools. And more popular one within the DevOps space. Yes.
Gotcha. So maybe how does that kind of work, or what is Terraform and why might someone use it? And we can maybe get into how it works as well.
For sure. Yeah. So basically Terraform is a HashiCorp. So the parent company is HashiCorp, and it's their tool to enable that infrastructure as code functionality. There's a open source version of it, and then there is also like an enterprise plan which includes Terraform Cloud. But we don't have to get into that. So what it does is it has its own syntax, which might sound daunting to few people, but it is called HCL, so HashiCorp's own language, and you define your infrastructure in bits of codes that, hey, I want a VM in Azure to host my React app. So you will have a specific syntax, which again is available on, Terraform's documentation on how to do that. But the major benefit of Terraform compared to, so there are other infrastructure as code tools like Azure Bicep, which is, as you can, kind of predict or guess, that it's Azure's infrastructure as code tool. So you can only deploy infrastructure to Azure. AWS has CloudFormation, but the limit is that you can only deploy it to AWS. Terraform solves the purpose of, it doesn't matter what your cloud provider is. They have got, and these are called providers, so the term is provider. They have got providers to deploy your code as infrastructure to all these cloud providers that you can think of. So AWS, GCP, Azure, DigitalOcean, Linode, Cloudflare. And that's where, Terraform, that's why how Terraform gained popularity is the cloud agnostic nature. So you're not locked with a vendor, right? And coming back to the providers, so there is a specified provider for Azure, there is a specified provider for AWS, there is a specified provider for GCP, and so on. And teams within Azure and AWS have collaborated with Terraform to make these providers available. And then we can talk about how, Terraform basically works.
So to me, it sounds like Terraform, like we talked about, is a tool that you can use to implement infrastructure as code. So you can have this code file that can effectively deploy your entire infrastructure. And the reason why it sounds like Terraform is a solution that gained a lot of popularity is because it's kind of decoupled from the platform that you're using. So regardless of whether you're using AWS or Google Cloud Platform or whatever it might be, that Terraform can kind of work across these different platforms, so you avoid that lock-in. Does that sound like a generally good summary why Terraform is useful there?
Yeah.
Perfect. And when it comes to Terraform, you mentioned that it has kind of its own specific programming language. So maybe if we could just kind of, and this does not have to be super technical. I think most people just listen to this podcast, so I don't think getting too technical will be incredibly helpful, but I think maybe just an overview on how this would kind of look. Like, say that someone has their application and they're trying to solve this problem of being able to deploy this application with just kind of their code file. How would it kind of look like? What steps would they need to take to actually like use Terraform and to start kind of writing out this infrastructure as code?
Yeah, definitely. I think the easiest, so let's say you have a web app and you have done local testing and you want it to live on the internet, and you decide that I want to host it on GCP or Azure. It doesn't matter. First of all, what you have to make sure is you have Terraform's CLI installed locally, right? So you can download the MSI itself, or you could, if you use any package managers, you can do, something install Terraform. I'm familiar with Mac, so you can do brew, install Terraform, and that would install the executable locally so that you can create the necessary files. So the main kind of important file is main.tf. You usually name it main, And then .tf is the extension that Terraform uses. And what you do is you have to define a provider on the top. As I said in the beginning, if you're working with AWS, you want to make sure that provider is listed on the top, that you're using AWS provider, and you will be launching infrastructure to AWS. And then if it's GCP, you say provider, GCP, and the versioning. So all these providers have different version. They get updated as, there are new product offerings that GCP might have. So you want to make sure Terraform's provider is up to date. And then after you have imported the provider, just like as you would do in React or in Python, where you do pip, you use different libraries to help you streamline your process. You import this provider, and then you define resources that you want for your app. So, for example, if you want to deploy a bucket, right? So a bucket is basically object storage. You would say resource. And let's take an example of AWS. You would say resource, S3 bucket, and then the name of the bucket. And then you will also have to define some parameters. Is this bucket public, private? And you can set all kinds of settings. Once you have done that, you save your file and you do Terraform. You could do a check too if your Terraform code is formatted correctly. So you can do Terraform FMT, and that would check through things and make sure everything looks good. And then you do Terraform plan. So plan basically allows you to kind of get a rough draft of what will be deployed. Again, these are resources that will be deployed to these cloud providers, and you might want to see, hey, before I do anything, before a server is launched, I want to see what is all going at so that I'm not charged, X amount of dollars. So you do Terraform plan, it'll spit out, an output saying, hey, I see that you had an S3 bucket that needs to be deployed and additional resources that you might have defined in main.tf. After you are happy with the plan, you can do Terraform apply. And this is the main command. So this would actually ask Terraform to use AWS provider and deploy that S3 bucket. It will also, after you do apply, it'll also ask you one more time that, hey, are you sure you want to deploy these resources? And you have to type yes. Just like in Linux, you do sudo apt-get update or upgrade, you have to type yes. And then it goes out, talks to the AWS API. So Terraform converts all this code that you have written to API calls to deploy a bucket. And then that bucket is, deployed in AWS. The other thing is you also need secrets or like API key, right? So you will need an AWS IAM access key and secret key in order to authenticate Terraform to AWS, because you'll be using your own AWS account to deploy these resources. So Terraform needs a way to authenticate and deploy those resources to your account within AWS. Similarly in GCP and similarly in Azure. And you can store that, like a usual secret within the .env file, or there are other authentication methods that you can use. But yeah, that is kind of the rough idea.
Gotcha. So just how you do it with, really any other external package, you first need to install Terraform. And then once you do that, you create the .tf file, and then that's where you can use the Terraform's own language and syntax to kind of define the different resources within your infrastructure. And then you can run a command to then go, either you can see the plan that Terraform's like, okay, this is what we're going to do if you try to go apply this. Then if that looks good, you can then go apply it, and Terraform will communicate with whatever provider that you're using to kind of then deploy all of your infrastructure and stuff. So that sounds really, really cool there. To me, part of it like feels like magic, but I mean, that is definitely a cool tool there. And I think that kind of with that, if someone was looking to kind of dive into Terraform further and to start learning it, do you have like any advice for them to kind of go about learning Terraform, or is there anything that they should watch out for when first getting into Terraform, or what's kind of your advice there?
Yeah, I think the documentation team at Terraform has done a great job. Um, find out what cloud provider you want to work with. So if it's Azure, go to that provider's documentation. So Terraform has this registry. I think people who have worked with, think of it as NPM. So you know how NPM has all these different packages, but if you go to NPM's website and look up one particular package, you can find all the parameters, the functions that you can use, right? And similarly, all these providers that exist on Terraform's registry have, a good amount of documentation that I think will put you up to speed, whether it's launching a bucket to having a really complex architecture of, where you have to design VPCs and have multiple VMs launched. So I think documentation is the first starting point where I would start. Not, I'll be shameless here and plug my Terraform and GCP course that just came out on Free Code Camp. I personally, when was, trying to go from tech support to cloud engineer, I had to gain some front-end skills. I used Free Code Camp back then with their JavaScript and HTML and CSS curriculum. So I always had like huge respect to the team behind Free Code Camp. But yeah, go check out the course. It covers all the necessary things that you need to get started with Terraform. There are concepts like state files, because once you have deployed all of this infrastructure, Terraform remembers what has been deployed already, because you don't want, a new S3 bucket being created every time you do apply. So there is concept of state, how secrets are managed, and how you can break down your Terraform file just so that it's not just one file. There are some advanced concepts, because otherwise your main.tf can get as big as 2,000 lines of code, which is not a good practice.
Gotcha. And I absolutely agree. I'm a big supporter of Free Code Camp. I use them a lot when I'm completely self-taught, and I use Free Code Camp a lot when I was kind of starting out with things, and I still continue to use them to this day to learn about new things. And I also have a course coming out in Free Code Camp here pretty soon. I'm not sure where they're going to finally publish that, but everybody listening, keep your eye out for that. It's going to be using Cypress to test your JavaScript applications. So that should be cool. But yeah, I think that would be a great place to start for people. I've watched your course, so I could definitely attest to it's very well put together with everything, and definitely thought through, nice structure to everything as well. So I think with that, another kind of question that I would have is like, when might someone want to use like infrastructure as code? Like, is there a good point in someone's application when it's like, hey, we probably need something like this? Or like if someone just has a application that they, someday want to have, thousands of users, when might be a good chance for them to, or when's a good point to start pulling in things like Terraform or infrastructure as code? Should it be like right away, or should they wait until they have this use case? Or what do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think personally, like when I started learning Terraform, it was not solely because of personal interest. It was because there was this huge opportunity at work to save time when we were deploying, our product app. So the usual new release, you could say, or new version of our SaaS product, when it would go out, it usually took us an entire weekend. So like a Saturday and Sunday that we would have to spend to make sure of our customers are up to date. We were able to reduce that time from being a whole weekend to 3 hours on Friday. So I think the power that Terraform brought was we were able to automate all this deployment that we were doing. There were some things that were already automated with PowerShell and Bash scripts, but like Terraform was like just like, I know it might not sound like it's a silver bullet, but at that time in given situation it was. And now we would just go in and do Terraform apply and say yes, and it would do VPC. it will launch VPCs, it will launch EC2 instances, would connect them to new database servers, and also we would do this Terraform destroy for the old infrastructure, so that old version of the infrastructure is cleaned up and the new one is stood, and everything was manageable because we were 6 DevOps engineers, right? And managing infrastructure via code is magic. Whereas if, it's in AWS's console, you don't know who launched this, random web server. Like, it's hard to track. Whereas if you make a change in your Terraform file, and all of this existed in source control. So we used Bitbucket at the time. So everything is manageable, way more manageable than just going through the UI, right? You have these code files, you have versioning, because you can go back and see who added a new VPC and who approved it. So things like that. I think working within a DevOps team, I think tools like this really help. But if you have personal interest, I know I'm not answering the question with a yes or no answer, but if you're a person, like just an individual who is interested in learning Terraform, I would say, yeah, pick any web app that you have, see where you want to deploy it, and use Terraform to write the underlying infrastructure where you want to deploy it. And I think that will just make you more comfortable with using Terraform. I think there are too many benefits. Now you have your infrastructure defined as code within your source control, whether it's GitHub or GitLab, whatever Git tool you use. And it also shows when you're applying for jobs that you not only, know front end, but you also understand bits of infrastructure and how these apps are hosted. So yeah.
And it seems like with some of the latest releases of like AI code interpreters and stuff like that, part of me feels like one of the biggest value adds a developer can have is taking the entire infrastructure and being able to bring it all together to help deploying things. As I feel like we're going to get to some point where AI is going to be able to write the React component that you want, but it might be able to do that, but it still might take a developer to kind of piece all this infrastructure together and help with that. But I'm not good at predicting the future, so we'll see how things go. But I definitely see the benefit of using something like Terraform and learning more about DevOps and stuff like this. I think, it definitely increases your value as a developer that you can add these sort of things to your company and stuff. And to me, it sounds like you guys were kind of finding that when you go to deploy your application, it would just end up taking a ton of time and take up your weekends and stuff like that. And then you kind of saw that you had this problem, so you went and found this solution. And we had a very similar thing at the company I work for, to which my engineer manager, he would typically try to deploy our latest release on a Thursday, and then we'd have like a testing party on Friday. And we came to find out that he started not being able to fully deploy our application on Thursday. So we wouldn't be able to have our testing session on Friday, and it would just kind of leak into the weekend and stuff like that. So we also ran into the same problem, and we just kind of finished the process of setting up Terraform and kind of getting that implemented and all that stuff. And like you said, it goes much faster now. We can actually deploy in a single day. So yeah, definitely some really good benefits there. And maybe as just one kind of final question to end on here, are there any common mistakes that someone makes when kind of starting to use Terraform? Maybe they're a little bit more beginner to it and they're not totally familiar with it. Is there any mistakes that, you made or that you see people make when kind of first starting to use Terraform?
There definitely are. I think security is one of them. So as I said, since you will have to somehow authenticate Terraform to talk to your cloud provider, and with AWS, it can be done through secret keys and access keys. Make sure they're secure. Like, don't commit them to your repository on GitHub. Use, best practices that Terraform recommends on how these secrets should be managed. Use environment variables wherever, it's Yeah. And then also there is one other thing where you will see a drift in state file. So the Terraform generates this state file as soon as you initiate a new project with Terraform. And what this state does is it remembers what your infrastructure is at a certain point. So if the bucket that you just created, if it has been deployed, the state file is where that information is stored, that this bucket has been deployed. And if you do Terraform apply again, it would say, hey, this is already deployed. I'm not going to do anything. But let's say you change the variable where the name of the bucket was XYZ1 and you changed it to XYZ2. And now you do Terraform apply, it would say, oh, the bucket before was XYZ1. This is a new name. So I'm going to deploy it. So now you'll have two buckets. Now think of it as if you're working in teams, this state file is stored locally until and unless you have configured a remote backend. And so you have to figure out a way to configure a remote backend, which is basically a central location where the state file will be stored. Otherwise, every engineer would have a different version of state file locally. And now you'll have this mess where everyone is on a different kind of version of their infrastructure. So these are the two really common kind of problems that I see that people run into is either state file drifts, and now you have to destroy everything and start launch new infrastructure, or you committed your secrets to a public repo.
Yeah, and I would say the committing secrets to a public repo, that definitely isn't just a Terraform specific thing. Definitely applies to your React apps and everything. Make sure not to push those .env files to GitHub, and that can be a mess to try to clean that up as well. And it sounds like the other one is trying to avoid that kind of state drift of everybody having their own local version of their Terraform build and stuff like that, as that can kind of get unmanageable and stuff like that. So yeah, generally just a couple of nice things to be aware of there when getting into Terraform. But Rishab, I think we are coming up on time here. If people are like, hey, this guy really knows his stuff here, they want to learn more about you and stay up to date with the content that you're producing, we already talked about your course on Free Code Camp, but is there anywhere else that they can go to kind of follow you online?
So I am rishabkumar.com is my website. All of my socials are linked there. If you're a LinkedIn or Twitter person, everything is in there. But I also have a YouTube channel where I produce, cloud and DevOps content. And you can also kind of see my journey, how I went from tech support to being an evangelist now at Twilio. But yeah, there is also a Terraform and Azure course there. But yeah, if you're interested in checking it out, the YouTube channel is also called Rishab Kumar. And yeah, that's the place where people can find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I definitely learned a ton, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me.